look at the history of women that have made a significant impact in the United States and Canada in the area of sexuality. Tune in and learn something new about your own past. Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Baer, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Well, welcome to the first episode of season 3. This is me by myself, as you can see if you're on YouTube right now. I am surrounded by a library. I'm at the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection in Indiana. And this is my home base. I have been very fortunate to be appointed the senior scholar at this library where I learn something new every day. There are so many different books and pieces of art and collections of history about sexuality. Right now I'm in the center, and next door is the Leather Library that talks about the history of kink. And it's a special place. And if you ever get a chance to visit, it definitely should be on your list if you're interested in sexuality. So I wanted to share with you today in this first episode some of the names of some of the individuals who have made a significant impact in women's sexuality in the United States and I would say the Western Hemisphere. It's interesting because when I mentioned these names, very few of them, my university students, knew who they were. And I think it's basic cultural literacy of women's sexuality to know who these individuals are and the significant impact they made and are making to the sexual expression, the open expression of our sexuality. And this season, like the last 2 seasons, I'm going to bring you stories from the past, but mostly individuals from today that I interview who are marching to the beat of their own drum in their own way, perhaps in an area that you never thought about. So I hope you enjoy season 3 as much as I enjoyed recording it. This season, we're starting in May 2023, and I'll be releasing these in general every 2 weeks and sharing all the interviews that I've done. So please hit subscribe and take a look at the new episodes as they come out. So let's venture back to the beginning of the 20th century. Like, where would you start talking about the individuals who made a very significant impact on women's sexuality in the United States? And I think we have to start with Margaret Sanger. Do you remember Margaret Sanger? You probably studied about her in school, right? Probably in sex education class. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. She fought for women's reproductive rights, and specifically the access to birth control. She was all about taking control of our own bodies and having our sexual autonomy. And those ideas were pretty radical at the time. And so she is somebody that definitely should be on your list of women who have made a contribution to our ability to express our sexuality in a joyful way, in a way that we don't have to be afraid of getting pregnant if we have sex. So, Margaret Sanger. Now, where would you go next? There are so many choices. And you wouldn't necessarily pick the same individuals that I'm choosing today to share with you. But I'd like to jump to the 1920s and someone named Josephine Baker. Do you know Josephine? She's a fierce performer who definitely rocked the 1920s with her sexy androgynous style. She was all about shaking up the status quo and breaking gender and racial stereotypes. Josephine Baker embraced her bisexuality publicly and had numerous affairs with both men and women. And she generally lived her life on her own terms. And again, in the 1920s, this was not something that was frequently done. And, I could mention so many musicians that have done that, and I'm going to mention a few more in a few minutes. So, Josephine Baker, did you know who she is? Let's move to the 60s and 70s, the women's rights movement, feminism. Who would you list there? Right? Think for a moment. Who were leaders of the women's rights movement? I would definitely mention Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine, Betty Friedan, right? Instrumental writer, speaker, leader of the women's rights movement, wrote, you ready? I'm going to hesitate so you can yell it out where you're listening from this, wrote The Feminine Mystique. And Sue Firestone, The Dialectic of Sex. She's a Canadian. And if we think about the 60s and 70s and the women's rights movement really taking off, and it was about our sexual autonomy. In fact, well, maybe I'll tell you a secret. I've been working on a book for a year now, and I have another year worth of research. And I am interviewing women who came out sexually in the 1970s, in whatever form of sexuality. And these are the women who have kind of led the way for the rest of us to step forward in our freedom and ability to express ourselves sexually the way that we want. And so while Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Firestone are not known for sexuality per se, it's all about women's rights in general, which include our bodily autonomy. Okay, so where would you go next? I'm going to pick a few people from the 1980s. Why? Well, because that's kind of my era of coming out in sexuality, and there are quite a few individuals that I wanted to make sure to mention today. And let me choose a pop star, a writer, and a porn star. Why not, right? Who would you choose? 1980s. Who influenced American society? We'll just take American society the most insofar as our expression of sexuality. Well, the first one I'd have to pick would be Madonna. You have to talk about Madonna. Pop icon who definitely challenged sexual boundaries with her very provocative image and lyrics. She embraced her bisexuality as well and challenged the traditional notions of femininity. She spoke very openly and sang very openly and danced very openly, expressing her sexual desires and the expression of her sexuality, right? I remember her album coming out with the sex book, the big sex book in the 1980s, and it was so controversial all the time. Another person from the 1980s era that I remember so vividly is Susie Bright. Susie Bright is a prominent figure, a modern day leader of a sexual liberation movement. Her voice predominantly has been out there for women, a feminist voice, but also for LGBTQ communities since the 1980s. And you can say, well, today that's not that big of a deal. Being gay or being queer is, not that radical. Well, for those who live with those identities, it is very radical and very political. And Susie Bright's voice as an advocate for those communities in the 1980s was quite significant. Her work centers not only on sexuality and sexual freedom, but also sexual politics. So we'd have to mention her. And my last individual that really I was aware of, I really don't or didn't know porn stars per se. Porn in the 1980s, there's this great big kind of fight between the traditional feminists or the more radical feminists and this new sex positive vocal culture. And these sex wars happened in the 1980s. And I definitely am going to do an episode about the feminist sex wars in the 80s this season. But the individual who stood out to me the most as a porn star during this time was Nina Hartley. And she still makes appearances, as does Susie Bright and Madonna. Nina Hartley was one of the most famous and influential female porn stars of the 1980s and beyond. She was a prominent figure in the adult film industry over 3 decades and is an outspoken advocate for sexual liberation and feminist pornography. One of my, and I'm just going to put this out here on the air here, and maybe I'll get lucky, I don't know, but one of my greatest, I don't know, can I say ambitions? I don't think it's ambitions. One of the individuals that I would like most to meet person to person and even interview on this podcast would be Nina Hartley. I have been a fan for many, many years. Her work challenges the stigma around sex work and very much promotes a sex positive culture. She talks about the importance of consent and sexual education. And I'm following along in her footsteps in the sex education area, and I'm very enthusiastic about consent as well. So, women from my era. Well, what about today? Who would you choose today? Let's make it an easy category. Pop music. Who would you say is making a big splash in being advocates for women's sexuality today? I'm going to pick Rihanna and Cardi B. They are absolutely modern day icons of the sexual liberation movement who break gender roles and embrace their own sexuality on their own terms. These women challenge the traditional notions of femininity and reclaim their bodies and their sexuality for themselves. And today's generation, big time fans of Rihanna and Cardi B, maybe you are. If you are watching this on YouTube, you've seen some photos today. I've put up some photos of the individuals that I'm talking about. But if you're listening to this podcast or watching, put down, right in the chat or the area in comments, who would you add to this list of significant 20th century women who've made a mark on women's rights, women's sexuality in the 20th century? There are many individuals who have paved a way for many of us to walk through. the path that they lay down for our sexual liberation, our ability to express ourselves. They challenge the sexual norms of the time, and many were ostracized or stigmatized, but nevertheless, they still went forward to explore their sexuality, many without fear of judgment or persecution. Their stories indeed are a testament of the power of women, and the power of women when we embrace our sexuality and celebrate our sexuality. So, buckle up for this season because we are going to be looking at some non traditional ways that women are also today breaking those stereotypes of what a woman's role is or how to run a business. Or I'm just thinking of some of the episodes, or, how to be a pole dancer, but not dance, but start a business, a wellness business around poles, where we usually think of pole dancers and sex workers. We're going to take a look at pole yoga this season. We're also going to look at digital nomads, the history of kink, so many topics, so many wonderful women. And if you are one of those women that are challenging the status quo and you march to the beat of a different drummer, this is your podcast to listen to. Please click subscribe, but also maybe to appear for an interview this season. I have some openings for the end of the season. So get on my schedule. Let's book a time where I can interview you about how you march to the beat of a different drummer. Till next time, I'm Dr. Tony Bear, sexologist, professional speaker, and podcast host of the Radical Rhythm podcast. Thank you for listening to the Radical Rhythm podcast today. It has truly been my pleasure to invite guests and talk to you about my passion, the joy in our sexuality, and radical women who march to the beat of a different drum. See you next week, and don't let anyone dim your shine.